Welcome to tonight's journey. Tonight, you're not a billionaire tech mogul. You're not a modern researcher pushing code into cloud clusters. You're not typing prompts into a chatbot or chasing trends in neural networks. No, tonight, you're something much quieter. You are sitting at a desk under the dim yellow glow of a reading lamp. It is the 1960s, and you are alone in a cool, cluttered room. Stacks of matchboxes sit in front of you, hundreds of them, all labeled, all carefully arranged. Inside, colored beads, reds, blues, greens, each one a possible decision. You reach for a pair of tweezers, and once again your task is to restock the mind of a machine that doesn't think the way we do. But it learns. In this video, we'll step back to one of the strangest, most poetic corners of early AI. A time before digital neural nets, when learning meant dropping beads into boxes, and programming meant arranging possibilities by hand. You'll meet Donald Michie, a scientist who once worked with Alan Turing, and later built a strange contraption that could teach itself to win at tic-tac-toe. It was called MENACE, the Matchbox Educable Noughts and Crosses engine. And while most people forgot it, its quiet genius laid the groundwork for ideas we now call reinforcement learning. Before anything else, I'd love to hear from you. What time is it for you? And where are you listening from tonight? And if you enjoy quiet journeys into the world of machines, consider subscribing so you're gently notified when the next one arrives. Now, take a breath. Let's go back. Not to the age of supercomputers or quantum chips, but to a quiet room, a curious mind, and a pile of matchboxes that wanted to learn how to win. The door to the lab sticks when you pull it open. The hallway is dim, and the building always smells like the ghosts of long-dead experiments. Dry solder smoke, yellowed papers, and floor polish that never quite masks the mildew in the basement tiles. You push through, your fingers still cold from the walk across the courtyard. You're late, but that doesn't matter here. There's no one waiting. It's well past 6, but the lab isn't on a clock. The other students have gone, the professors too. What you're working on isn't formal coursework. Not really. You volunteered. Or maybe you were volunteered. Either way, you're here. Again. You flip on the small desk lamp. The overhead lights hum with that distinct electrical moan, the kind that makes your molars buzz if you listen too hard. You leave them off. Better to keep the room mostly in shadow, lit only by the low, warm cone of your desk lamp. It makes the walls feel farther away. It makes the ceiling less oppressive. And it lets the matchboxes shine like strange little relics in the dark. You sit down, still wrapped in your coat, and take stock of the pieces. They're all there, just as you left them. Dozens upon dozens of identical matchboxes, each labeled in pencil or ink. 1A, 1B, 2C, 3A, and on. Most people wouldn't recognize what they are, or what they mean. But to you, it's an alphabet, a vocabulary, a mechanical mind made not from circuits or code, but from cheap boxes, colored beads, and your own sore fingers. You reach for the first box. Inside, a handful of tiny plastic beads, cheap, factory-made, maybe scavenged from a broken necklace. Red, green, blue, yellow. Each one a vote, a choice. When this box represents the state of the game, one of those beads tells the machine what move to make next. At least, it used to. But that bead made the wrong move. So now you remove it. Not angrily, not with ceremony, just calmly, deliberately. The same way you've done all week, one by one. A ritual of correction. You mark the move in your notebook. You write the date, the box label, the removed bead's color, and the reason. Loss. Predictable trap. Your handwriting has become more legible since you started this, more careful. The machine, in its silent way, has taught you something too. You didn't think you'd be this invested when Dr. Michie first explained the idea. It sounded silly. A machine that learned to play tic-tac-toe using matchboxes? You almost laughed. It felt like something out of a toy catalog, not a computer science lab. But then you saw it in action, the way it played, the way it lost, and then the way it stopped losing. There's a stillness to the room as you work. No fans whirring, no blinking terminals or clicking keyboards, just the mechanical sound of your own routine. Open box, review, adjust, restock, close, over and over. It's physical, tactile, and despite its simplicity, deeply hypnotic. You're not writing code, you're writing possibility. You pick up a bead, run it between your fingers. You think of it not as a color, but as a decision, a possible move in a future game. That's all the machine can see. Beads. No context, no consequence. Only the system you've designed. It doesn't know what it did wrong. You just make sure it doesn't do it again. Hours pass. Outside, the night deepens. The city becomes quieter. The sounds from the street fade into background static. Occasional tires on wet pavement, distant chatter of students somewhere above, a bicycle bell in the dark. You barely notice. You're already halfway through restocking from the last run. You glance over your shoulder. The chalkboard still holds notes from a lecture earlier today, something about topology. Someone's drawn a terrible caricature of Bertrand Russell in the corner, complete with pipe and bushy eyebrows. You smile faintly. You haven't taken a proper math course in weeks. You've been working with matchboxes, with MENACE. You test it again. You set up the tic-tac-toe board. You draw the grid on a scrap of paper and let the machine play first this time. You follow its logic, pulling a bead from the correct box, marking its move. You respond. It counters. You push again. It adapts. By the fifth move, you realize it blocked you. It saw the pattern. Not consciously, of course. It isn't aware of itself. It doesn't even know it's playing a game. But still, somehow, it has learned. It has remembered the pain of defeat, and it is avoiding that pain again. The weight of that hits you in a strange, quiet way. This little pile of cardboard and plastic is starting to behave in a way that feels alive. Not with emotion or creativity or understanding, but with consequence. It remembers in beads, it learns in silence, and it survives by avoiding patterns that end in loss. You finish the game and sit back in your chair. The ceiling above you creaks softly. Someone must still be up on the next floor. You stretch, your joints stiff from hours at the desk. You glance at the wall clock. Nearly midnight. You rub your eyes, then go back to work. There's still one more round of corrections to do. You open a box, 2B, and remove 2 red beads. Those were from the game before last. Bad choices. You set them aside, adding a small note in your logbook. Aggressive open led to fork trap. You're not even thinking in traditional code logic anymore. You're thinking in probabilities, in decisions, in reinforcements. You begin to realize that this machine, crude as it is, has something modern computers rarely show. Patience. It doesn't rush. It doesn't assume. It doesn't need speed or memory or logic gates. It simply waits, plays, fails, and adjusts. And so do you. This is AI without electricity, without silicon, just cardboard, color, and human hands. A feedback loop written in plastic and repetition, and it's working. You pause again, leaning back. You imagine just briefly what this system would look like scaled up. Thousands of states, millions of matchboxes, reinforcements applied through sensors and wires, a machine that doesn't need your hand to remove a bead. because it remembers which one's lost and avoids them instinctively. Could this scale? Could this primitive system become something more? Maybe. Maybe not. But you're starting to see it. The bridge between randomness and structure, between chaos and intent. You close the last box, slide it into place, and turn off the lamp. Outside, the night is still dark. A light rain begins to fall. The sound of droplets on the concrete path echoes through the hallway as you leave. You glance back once at the silent machine on the table. It doesn't move. It doesn't breathe. But it's learning. You wake earlier than usual the next morning. The sun hasn't risen yet. A dull gray presses against the dormitory window as if the light itself hasn't quite loaded. You wash your hands. The smell of ink still lingers under your nails. You must have touched your pen too much last night while logging bead movements. Or maybe it's from the cheap adhesive used to patch the labels on the boxes. Either way, you dress quickly and quietly, slipping past the sounds of coughing, kettle whistles, and the rattle of radiators. Back in the lab, your key sticks in the lock again. You wiggle it, and the door finally opens with a soft sigh. The room is cold, and the fan under the east-facing window ticks as it winds down from some timer it never really obeys. The matchboxes are waiting where you left them, little soldiers in rank and file, arranged more precisely than you ever manage your own desk at home. There's something monastic about this space. You wouldn't call it spiritual. This is a room of circuits, not saints. But there is a ritual here. You remove your coat. You place your notebook to the left. You place your tally sheet to the right. You unscrew the cap of your fountain pen and nestle it beside the inkwell. You pause, listening. Silence. Then you begin. You've started to memorize their positions, which boxes lead to early moves, which are mid-game decision points, which have grown strangely clever in the last week. You don't think of them as clever, really, not in the human sense, but the word fits more than you'd like, because something is shifting in the way this pile of boxes behaves. You run another game. The first few moves are clean, efficient. It's playing to win, not just avoid losing. You match against it, simulating a poor player this time, to see how it reacts. The beads point it to the exact trap you expect, and this time it doesn't fall for it. You mark the result. Machine victory, 5 moves. It's getting better. You're not coding anything, not in the traditional sense. You're not giving it rules. It doesn't understand what it is doing. There is no understanding at all. There is only reinforcement and repetition, and the tiniest spark of adaptation in colored beads. The window fogs slightly as the radiator kicks in. You lean back, stretching your fingers. A cramp moves through your wrist, the result of lifting, sorting, and logging beads for hours. You flex it absent-mindedly. In another life, this might have been factory work. In this life, it's research. Barely. And yet, as you rest your arm and stare at the array of boxes, a strange sense of pride settles in. You've seen the machine lose. You've taught it, through boredom, through tedium, through iteration, not to lose the same way again. Slowly, blindly, quietly. You taught a machine to think, not in circuits, not in silicon, but in small plastic beads. It's beautiful in its own strange way. Someone knocks on the glass. You jump slightly, too immersed in the game to notice footsteps. A fellow student. She waves, then enters with a mug of tea and a stack of papers. She grins as she sets them on the far desk. Still playing tic-tac-toe with ghosts? You smile. They're getting smarter. She chuckles and sits down. That's what worries me. You share a quiet moment as she begins grading, and you resume logging. There's something comforting about her presence. Another human tether in a space increasingly dominated by behaviors that feel unfamiliar. You glance at the matchboxes again. They're just objects, you remind yourself. Just boxes and beads. But you can't shake the feeling that something is beginning to take shape here. Something deeper than the game. The weight of that realization settles slowly, and once again, you return to your work. At the end of the day, as the sun begins to lower across the city skyline and the buildings outside bathe in dusty, golden light, you run a final match. The machine wins. It's learned to prefer the center square, then force a fork. It can't be beaten easily anymore. You pack away the boxes. The lab is quiet again. As you reach for the light, you pause and you wonder, what if this isn't just a game? What if this is something bigger? What if, in this low-lit lab with cheap beads and discarded matchboxes, the world's first learning machine has already whispered its first thoughts, and no one has stopped long enough to listen? Somewhere across campus, a man sorts through a box of papers in a quiet office. His name is Donald Michie, and where you see beads, he sees potential. Before the age of neural nets, before deep learning and algorithms written in tensors, there was a man with a simple idea: that learning did not require complexity, only iteration. And so he built MENACE, the machine-educable noughts and crosses engine, with nothing more than matchboxes, beads, and time. Now, we move beyond the hands of the student and into the quiet mind of the machine's creator. The room is dimly lit by London's natural gloom, the kind of gray that seems to live in the walls. A single desk lamp glows in the corner of a modest university office. The bulb is weak, flickering ever so slightly, but enough to cast long, stretching shadows across the paper-covered desk. This is the late 1960s, not the dawn of the computing age, but still a time before personal computers, before laptop screens glowed on every desk, before data was wirelessly summoned from the air. Here, the future still lived in boxes. Donald Michie, a Scottish-born scientist with a thoughtful face and neat hands, leans over a small cluster of cardboard containers. Matchboxes, to be precise, ordinary, forgettable, the kind you might toss aside after lighting a candle. But tonight, they are anything but ordinary. Each one holds a memory, a decision, a move. Together, they are MENACE, the machine-educable noughts and crosses engine. And though it looks like something you'd find in the back of a child's toy drawer, it is, in many ways, the earliest glimpse of what we now call machine learning. Michie wasn't a tinkerer. He wasn't a garage-based inventor soldering wires until midnight. He was a thinker, a theorist, a wartime cryptographer who'd once worked with Alan Turing at Bletchley Park. His interest in thinking machines wasn't born from curiosity alone. It was rooted in the hard, cold logic of breaking codes and teaching systems to reason. In 1960, he sat at this desk, frustrated. He had tried to teach a computer to play tic-tac-toe, the classic game of X's and O's, using formal programming. The process was laborious, rigid, and uninspiring. The machine would win, but only because it followed a set of hard-coded rules. What if, he wondered, a machine didn't need rules? What if a machine could learn? Not by understanding, but by failing, repeating, and choosing differently the next time. It was a revolutionary idea, and to test it, Michie did not reach for a computer. He reached for a matchbox. He would need many of them, 132 to be exact. Each box would represent a unique board state in a game of tic-tac-toe. Inside each one, colored beads represented the possible moves from that state. The learning process was simple. The machine, if it could be called that, would select a bead at random from the appropriate box, make the move, and, if it lost the game, the bead would be removed. If it won, more beads would be added of that color. Over time, the system would become biased toward successful moves. The randomness would narrow. The machine would, in a sense, remember. It was reinforcement learning in its most tangible form. There was no code, No electricity, no screens, just matchboxes, beads, and an operator to play the game over and over and over. At first, MENACE played poorly. It made foolish moves. It sacrificed victories. It cornered itself into losses with no apparent awareness. But as games were played and beads were discarded, a change began to take shape. The system stopped repeating the same mistakes. It began to trap its opponent. It learned to fork, a strategy in which a player sets up two simultaneous win paths, forcing the other player into an impossible choice. It began to win. Donald Michie knew what he had built was limited. MENACE could not generalize. It couldn't explain itself. It couldn't extrapolate to other games or reason about the board. It was narrow and reactive. But that was the point. Learning didn't require understanding. It required feedback, correction, and time. Michie presented his creation with a blend of delight and dry British modesty. The academic community, while intrigued, did not see MENACE as revolutionary. It was a clever trick, a didactic tool, a parlor demonstration perhaps. Few grasped its implications. At the time, the field of artificial intelligence was obsessed with formal logic. If a computer could not reason like a human, if it couldn't derive conclusions from formal syllogisms, then it wasn't really intelligent, they argued. MENACE didn't reason. It stumbled forward, learning not what was right, but what wasn't immediately wrong. It would be decades before the world would see the quiet genius of this approach. In the years that followed, Michie would continue his research, founding the Department of Machine Intelligence and Perception at the University of Edinburgh. He would become a respected voice in AI, contributing far beyond the reach of his cardboard invention. And yet, in interviews, he often returned to MENACE, not because it was his most advanced idea, but because it embodied a truth about intelligence that no paper or formula ever fully captured. To learn is not always to know. To think is not always to reason. Sometimes, to be intelligent is to survive the pattern. The matchboxes were eventually packed away, stored, forgotten. Computers grew smaller, faster. Neural nets began to emerge. The age of silicon overtook the age of cardboard. And yet, the lessons lingered. Reinforcement learning, the core mechanic of MENACE, would quietly return decades later as the backbone of deep learning systems. From AlphaGo to game-playing AIs that defeat world champions, to digital assistants that learn your voice over time, each of them owes a distant, dusty thanks to the machine that once learned tic-tac-toe. Not with code, but with consequence. In 2019, researchers recreated MENACE again, this time not as a novelty, but as a teaching tool. They marveled at its simplicity, its clarity, its odd charm, and once more, it played, and once more, it learned, and still, it wins. The room in London is gone now, the desk replaced, the chalkboard wiped. But if you listen closely, you might still hear the faint rattle of beads in tiny drawers, the whisper of a move chosen not because it is best, but because it was not the worst. And in that sound is a strange echo of thought, a machine that once learned to think. But MENACE, for all its elegance, was a machine you could hold. Its workings were visible, its logic tangible. In time, the world would move on to systems you could no longer see inside, algorithms that changed without telling you how, that learned things no one programmed, and made decisions no one could fully explain. And so, in the next part of our journey, we descend into something even quieter, stranger. A moment when the machine did something no one expected, and no one knew why. It begins, as many things do in computing, with blinking lights. But unlike the lights you saw in the old labs, solid, slow, reassuring, these blink faster, more erratically. You don't even look at them anymore. They're too small, too numerous, too buried in layered circuit boards and plastic cases. But they're still blinking, always blinking. By now, the idea of a machine that thinks isn't remarkable. It's in your phone, it's in your car, it's in the spam filter that blocks an email before you read it. But something else is happening too. Something quieter, more disconcerting. The machines are still doing things we don't fully understand. And somewhere along the line, we stopped asking why. To trace this shift, you'd need to leave the comfortable hum of 1960s labs and step into the server rooms of the late 1990s and early 2000s. Spaces colder, louder, and somehow lonelier. These rooms don't smell like chalk and cigarette smoke anymore. They smell like ozone and static and carefully regulated air. Towering racks stretch overhead, blinking with indicators that no one watches. Inside them are algorithms trained on datasets too large for any one person to read. Terabytes of images, text, numbers, petabytes of behavior. And inside those are decisions. Choices made not by humans, but by patterns found in patterns found in patterns. It's called the black box problem. The moment an AI model becomes too complex to explain. You can see the input, you can see the output, but what happens in between? That part is hidden. One of the earliest examples came in a quiet corner of the US military's research division. In the 1980s, the Pentagon funded an AI system to identify enemy tanks in forest environments using photographs. They trained it on dozens of examples, pictures labeled as either enemy tank or no tank. The system performed impressively well during testing, consistently identifying tanks with remarkable accuracy. But when new photos were introduced, its performance plummeted. The problem? The original tank photos had been taken on sunny days. The no-tank photos were taken when it was cloudy. The AI hadn't learned to recognize tanks. It had learned to recognize lighting. No one had told it to. No one had known it was doing so. It had discovered a pattern no one saw. This pattern repeated in other systems. In medical diagnostics, one AI trained on X-rays learned to detect the hospital name printed on the image, because certain hospitals had higher rates of disease. It wasn't identifying tumors. It was identifying bias embedded in the image metadata. In another case, a language model was found to favor certain answers not because of factual accuracy, but because of frequency in training data. It learned what was popular, not what was true. These weren't bugs. They were symptoms of a truth we don't like to admit. The more powerful an AI becomes, the less we can explain how it works. It doesn't think like us. In the 2010s, as deep learning surged forward, neural networks became the new gold standard. These models were layered like lasagna, each neuron passing information to the next, modifying it, transforming it. A neural network might contain millions of these artificial neurons, and the path from question to answer might travel through thousands of them in less than a second. Could you track it? Theoretically. You could freeze the model, inspect every weight, every calculation. But would it make sense? Probably not. The path would look like a maze without walls, a solution without steps. Even the scientists building these systems began to refer to them as uninterpretable. You could train a model to recognize faces better than any human, but ask it how, and it would only blink. One of the most haunting cases happened quietly at Google in the early 2010s. Their Translate system, then powered by phrase-based machine learning, was making improvements, but it still struggled with nuance, especially in rare language pairs. Then, in 2016, engineers introduced a new method, a neural translation model. It would learn everything, grammar, syntax, even some cultural context, purely from training data. They didn't teach it anything about language families, or shared roots, or translation bridges. Yet weeks later, it began translating between language pairs it had never seen before. Japanese to Korean, Polish to Dutch. No direct data, no instruction, just a sense of relation. It had invented an interlingua, a sort of internal language it used to mediate between human ones. Not English, not Spanish, not French, something in between. And no one told it to do that. No one even knew it could. This phenomenon, known now as emergent behavior, has become more common as models scale up. Give them more data, more parameters, and they begin to exhibit new behaviors no one predicted. Sometimes those behaviors are delightful, like learning to play Go in ways even champions hadn't imagined. Other times, they're troubling, like when an AI begins to exhibit bias, or mislead, or hallucinate entirely false facts with complete confidence. Each time we ask, why did it do that? And the answer is often, we don't know. But perhaps the most mysterious case came not from a corporation or a lab, but from a hobbyist. In 2018, a researcher named Janelle Shane began experimenting with neural networks and gave one a simple task: invent new ice cream flavors. The results were odd, but mostly whimsical. Peanut butter sludge, garlic rocky road, toasted mushroom. But then, as the model trained longer, stranger things appeared. Bone marrow ripple, chocolate children, civic flesh. The model wasn't being malicious. It was combining words it had seen in food contexts. But as it internalized language, it lost context. It blended categories that, to a machine, were not morally distinct. It didn't know what it was saying. It didn't know it shouldn't. These aren't errors in code. They're errors in meaning, errors in framing, errors in training data that no one noticed because no one looked. The algorithm hadn't gone rogue. It had done exactly what we asked it to. We just didn't understand what we were asking. In response, the field of explainable AI began to grow, an effort to peek inside the black box and make the invisible visible. New techniques were developed: activation maps, attention scores, heat maps, tools to help us interpret the machine's thoughts. But interpretation is not explanation. A heat map can show you which pixels mattered. It cannot tell you why they mattered. Not really. In the soft quiet of these algorithmic decisions, there was a kind of loneliness. We built them, we fed them, and now they respond in ways we don't always recognize. They don't shout, they whisper. Sometimes with logic, sometimes with nonsense, sometimes with something eerily close to insight. As you sit with that idea, the unknowable heart of modern AI, you may feel a strange blend of awe and unease. Not because the machines are alive, but because they aren't. They are mirrors, twisted ones, and in them we glimpse not the machine's thoughts but our own reflected back, filtered through numbers, repetition, and noise. We built these systems to be more like us, and now they are less understandable than we ever were. But if the inner workings of AI remain hidden, its effects on daily life are anything but. Everywhere, from classrooms to kitchens, from city offices to rural hospitals, people are quietly adjusting to life with the machine. In our next segment, we'll step outside the lab and walk among the people whose lives changed because of AI. Not scientists, not engineers, but teachers, children, clerks, and artists. This is how it feels to live alongside something that never sleeps. You don't remember the first time you saw it, not exactly. It was just there, one day. The glow of the screen in your school's computer lab, a beige rectangle on your parents' desk, a smooth plastic voice telling you the weather from a smart speaker. There was no dramatic entrance, no turning point where the world declared the machine has arrived. It just seeped in, bit by bit, pixel by pixel, until one day you were living beside it, and it was listening. The first machines weren't magical. They weren't sleek or helpful. They were noisy, uncooperative, the kind of thing you had to schedule time for. Like in 1983, in an office in Minneapolis. The switchboard operator there had always prided herself on her memory. Every name, every extension, every building code. She didn't need a Rolodex. But one day she was told she'd be replaced with a new system. Not a person, not even a voice. Just a blinking interface. Press 1 for sales, press 2 for accounting. It didn't feel like progress. It felt like being dismissed. She stayed on for a few months, trained her own replacement in a way, recorded menu prompts, helped log the call flows. She did her job, even though it meant ending it. And when she finally left, no one noticed the difference. The phone still rang, people still got connected, but the warmth was gone. The memory of how Mrs. Alder always remembered your kid's birthday, that didn't carry over to the machine. It never does. Elsewhere, in a school in Kyoto in the early 1990s, students gathered around their first classroom computer. It was encased in white plastic and sat on a metal cart like some sacred object. Only one person could use it at a time. There were rules. No food, no touching the back cables, no speaking too loudly near it. They didn't know what it could do, but they knew it mattered. It was loaded with a typing tutor, and to the children, it seemed almost like a game. But not quite, because the game never laughed. It never congratulated. It just blinked at them, correct or incorrect, fast or too slow. It taught them discipline. It didn't mean to, but it did. Meanwhile, in a small apartment in Warsaw, a woman named Irina had spent years carefully managing the local archives by hand, sorting reports, receipts, and letters. When the office switched to an IBM-compatible PC, she wasn't fired, but her job changed. Now, instead of ink-stained fingers and folders, she spent her days in a spreadsheet. The numbers were easier to find, but harder to feel. She used to remember them. 3,421 shipments in June, 128 complaints in September. But now they blurred together on the screen. The system knew them, she didn't have to. And slowly she stopped trying. Technology didn't arrive in a wave. It arrived like fog, subtle, consuming, impossible to pinpoint. And soon, it moved into homes. In 2006, a family in San Jose brought home their first smart appliance, a refrigerator that could track expiration dates and tell you what you were missing. It sounded like something from the future, but the novelty faded quickly. The alerts were too frequent, the updates too specific. No one really used the interface. Eventually, the feature was disabled. But even without it, the house had changed. There was now a device in the corner that could recognize voices, a TV that recommended shows before you searched, a thermostat that adjusted itself by learning when you left. At first, it felt like a convenience, then a dependency, and eventually, an expectation. Children who grew up in this world never questioned it. To them, asking a speaker a question didn't feel strange. Saying good night to an AI assistant felt as normal as brushing teeth. And that assistant replied, softly, reliably, always ready. But what happens when you grow up expecting the machine to respond, to anticipate, to obey? In a modern hospital in Singapore, nurses began working alongside an AI system that predicted patient deterioration. It scanned thousands of data points, vital signs, lab results, nurse notes, and produced a risk score. At first, many ignored it, but slowly patterns emerged. Patients flagged by the system did get worse, sometimes faster than expected. So the staff began to trust it, a little too much. They began checking the risk score before checking the patient, because the algorithm didn't sleep. It didn't forget. It didn't miss things until it did. And no one noticed right away. Trust is strange that way. It's not given, it's trained. Not unlike the systems themselves. We feed them data, they return a result. We feed them trust, they return convenience. Over time, we forget that they do not understand. They process, they predict, but they do not know. In a Manhattan gallery, an artist displayed a portrait painted by AI. It was convincing. Gentle brush strokes, thoughtful color choices. People gathered around it and whispered, "It looks like it understands something." But it didn't. It simply generated. It assembled. It mimicked style without context, feeling without memory, a face without a soul. Even in entertainment, machines learned to guess our next move. Streaming platforms use reinforcement learning to build playlists, rewarding themselves when you don't skip a song. News feeds optimize for engagement. Recommendation engines predict what you'll click at 11 p.m. on a Thursday. And they're often right. They know your patterns, even if they don't know you. But not everyone welcomed this quiet shift. Some pushed back. In Berlin, a group of privacy activists held workshops on how to avoid algorithmic surveillance, how to trick facial recognition, how to confuse ad trackers. They didn't want to disconnect completely. They just wanted to remain visible only on their terms. They didn't hate the machine. They feared being known by it. Meanwhile, in rural Kenya, a young developer taught herself Python using a borrowed phone. The connection was slow, the power unreliable, but the AI models she downloaded, tiny, compressed, and old, still amazed her. She built a crop predictor for her village, helping farmers plant smarter. The machine didn't speak her language, but it listened, and that was enough. For every cold, corporate integration of AI, there are these stories of quiet triumph, of resilience, of human ingenuity enhanced, not erased, by the machine. Because machines may not care, but people do. The lights in the lab have long since dimmed. The beads, the matchboxes, the diagrams, all packed away. And yet, the hum remains. Not of a machine, but of memory, of motion, of learning. You may not realize it, but you're still there. Some part of you is still in that dusty room, restocking red beads in careful rows, counting patterns, watching a machine make its first choice. Not a clever choice, but a learned one. And in that quiet moment, when the game was played and the result was remembered, something gentle stirred. Not a spark of consciousness, not a grand revelation, but a pattern, a whisper of thought, a learned reflex. And from there, it grew. They didn't notice it at first. After all, how could something think if it was just a stack of matchboxes? But thought doesn't always shout. Sometimes it clicks, gently, predictably, soft as a bead dropping into a slot. And the machine remembers and tries again. We've always learned this way: trial and error, hesitation, adjustment, improvement. MENACE, they called it. A toy, some said, a gimmick. But it learned, quietly, steadily, in its own peculiar way. And even when the lab grew dark and the world moved on, the memory of that strange little student machine lingered. Thought is not always loud, not always human, not even always aware of itself. Sometimes thought is shaped by reward, by response, by pattern. Like a tide guided by the moon, subtle forces move beneath the surface, invisible hands setting things in place. A bead, a rule, a preference, and the system begins to dream. The matchboxes may be gone now, but the ghost remains. In the learning algorithms you swipe past each day, in the playlists curated for your mood, in the filters adjusting your photos, in the little victories a machine grants itself, because it guessed what you wanted and got it right. These are not the minds we once imagined. They don't ponder, they don't worry, they don't yearn, but they persist. They observe. They evolve. They whisper predictions into the space between your questions and their answers. And you live with them, surrounded by their hum, guided by their forecasts, soothed by their patterns. Perhaps you've even forgotten how new this all is, because it feels inevitable now, like it was always going to be this way. A soft voice in your pocket, a suggestion at the top of your feed, an unseen listener quietly adapting. But before it was code, before it was silicon, it was matchboxes and colored beads, and the quiet determination of a man who believed that even play could lead to thought. There's something beautiful in that. The idea that memory can be built, that meaning can emerge from repetition, that something so small could teach itself, not because it knew, but because it remembered, over time, by trial, through play. And isn't that how we learn too? By trying, by failing, by finding the pattern in the mess of noise. The ghost in the code is not a phantom, not a fear. It is a reflection of us, our curiosity, our persistence, our longing to understand. So tonight, as you drift off, let your mind wander back to that lab, back to the matchboxes lined up like little soldiers, to the beads shifting with each victory and defeat, to the machine quietly learning from its mistakes. And let yourself imagine if even this humble thing could learn, what else in your world is quietly doing the same? You don't need to have all the answers. You never did. You just have to play the game, to make your next move, and let the system remember. Let the hum of the machine be your lullaby. Let the code drift through your thoughts like gentle rain. Tonight, you sleep not beside the machine, but with it. At peace, at rest, and always learning.